I found the yellow paint at 6:12 on a Saturday morning. Not a warning sticker, not a polite HOA notice taped to my door. A thick, ugly yellow line had been sprayed straight across the mouth of my private driveway, from one edge of the concrete to the other, with the words,
As per the
"No
covenants,
parking,
conditions, and
HOA
restrictions,
fire
this
access,"
encroachment
stenciled
is
so large that
unacceptable.
anyone
We
driving
have
past
zero
would think my
tolerance for
own driveway
violations.
belonged to the neighborhood board. 2 orange cones sat in front of my garage entrance. Behind them was a temporary metal sign, zip-tied to a post that had not been there the night before. And standing beside it, holding a clipboard like she had just conquered foreign territory, was Marlene Whitaker, the HOA president. I stepped outside barefoot, still holding my father's prescription bag in one hand, and asked her why there was a fire lane painted across my driveway. She did not even look embarrassed. She said the board had approved a traffic safety improvement plan, and my driveway was now part of a restricted emergency access area. Then she pointed at my garage and told me that if I drove across that fresh paint without HOA authorization, the violation would be $500. A tow truck was already idling at the curb. That was the moment my stomach dropped. My father had a follow-up appointment that morning. He could not walk 2 houses down to street parking. The whole reason we bought that home was because the side driveway let him get from the garage to the car safely with his walker. I told Marlene this was private property. I told her the driveway was on my deed. I told her she had no right to block it. She smiled in front of 3 neighbors and said, "Owning a home here does not mean you own every access point the community depends on." Then she told the tow driver to stay close, just in case I decided to test the rules. For a few seconds, I wanted to pull those cones out of the ground and throw that sign into the street, but I did not touch anything. I took out my phone. I recorded the paint, the cones, the sign, the tow truck, Marlene's clipboard, and her voice telling me the HOA had control over my driveway now. She thought I was just documenting a fine. What she did not know was that buried in my closing papers was a recorded easement map from the county, signed more than 20 years earlier, stating that my driveway had to remain open, private, and unobstructed. And by the time the county surveyor, the fire marshal, and my attorney finished reading that map, Marlene would not be talking about $500 fines anymore. She would be explaining why the HOA painted over land it did not own. Before that yellow paint showed up, I was not the kind of person who argued with the HOA. I was the person who trimmed the hedges before anyone sent a reminder. I brought my trash bins in before sunset. I paid every assessment on time, even the ones that came with vague explanations and cheerful little phrases like community beautification. I read the newsletters, followed the mailbox color rules, and kept my head down because I had enough real problems inside my own house. My father had moved in with me after my mother passed. He had always been a proud man, the kind who fixed leaky faucets with one hand and refused help carrying groceries with the other. But after his hip surgery, the world became smaller for him. Stairs became obstacles. Uneven sidewalks became risks. A long walk from street parking was no longer an inconvenience. It was a threat. That driveway was the reason I bought the house. It was not a mansion. It did not have a pool, a view, or one of those kitchens people film for real estate ads. It was a modest 2-bedroom home at the curve of a quiet subdivision, with faded brick, an old maple tree in front, and a narrow concrete driveway running along the side of the house to a garage tucked behind it. To most people, it probably looked ordinary. To me, it looked like independence. My father could step from the kitchen into the garage, steady himself with one hand on the wall, fold his walker into the back seat, and sit down without crossing a busy street or climbing a curb. On rainy days, I could back the car right up to the garage door and keep him dry. On bad pain days, I could get him to his appointments without turning the whole morning into a battle against concrete, distance, and pride. So when people say a driveway is just a driveway, I know they have never watched someone they love measure freedom in 20-foot stretches of pavement. The neighborhood itself looked peaceful from the outside. Fresh lawns, matching mailboxes, seasonal wreaths on front doors, kids riding bikes in the evenings while sprinklers clicked across perfect strips of grass. When I moved in, the HOA seemed annoying but manageable. There were rules about fence height, exterior paint, holiday decorations, and where basketball hoops could stand. Nothing that felt worth fighting over. Then Marlene Whitaker became HOA president. She was the kind of person who could turn a welcome committee into a compliance inspection. At first, she came across as organized. She spoke in polished phrases about protecting property values, maintaining standards, and preserving the character of the community. But slowly, the tone changed. Friendly reminders became violation notices. Questions at meetings became interruptions. Neighbors who disagreed with her were accused of not caring about safety. Under Marlene, the HOA started acting less like a neighborhood board and more like a private government with no elections coming soon enough. People stopped chatting freely at the mailboxes because somebody was always worried a complaint would make its way back to her. A retired couple got fined because their mulch was the wrong shade of brown. A young family received a warning for leaving a stroller on their porch for one afternoon. Another homeowner told me he had been threatened with legal fees over a satellite dish that had been approved by a previous board. I heard all of it and stayed quiet. Not because I agreed with her, not because I was afraid exactly. I just did not have the energy to make myself a target. My days were work, prescriptions, physical therapy appointments, insurance phone calls, grocery runs, and trying to keep my father's spirits from collapsing under the weight of needing help. The driveway was the one thing that made everything manageable. When I bought the house, the closing packet had included a boundary survey, title insurance documents, and a recorded access easement attached to the subdivision plat. The realtor had explained it quickly, pointing at a page with thin black lines and legal descriptions. She said the side driveway had been created when the subdivision was first built, before the HOA had the power it liked to pretend it had now. The easement protected access to my garage because of the odd layout of the lots and the common area beside my property. At the time, I barely understood it. I only knew it meant nobody could block that driveway. I put those documents in a plastic storage bin in the hallway closet, along with mortgage papers, appliance manuals, old tax returns, and warranties for things I had already forgotten I owned. For years, that bin stayed untouched. The driveway stayed open. My father came and went safely. I followed the rules. The HOA collected its dues. Life was not easy, but it was stable. Then the board announced a new traffic safety improvement plan. The email arrived on a Tuesday evening with the usual HOA language, all polished and empty. It said certain access areas would be restripped to improve emergency response and reduce unauthorized parking. It did not include a map. It did not list affected addresses. It did not say anything about private driveways, recorded easements, county approval, or the fire marshal. I remember reading it at the kitchen table while my father sorted his pills into a weekly organizer. He noticed my face and asked if something was wrong. I told him no. I wanted that to be true. If you have ever had a small piece of your home become the thing that keeps your family safe, you already understand why I should have paid closer attention. And if this kind of HOA overreach has ever happened to you or someone you know, leave a comment. Because sometimes these stories sound unbelievable until the day a board president decides your property rights are just an obstacle to her next project. That night, I filed the email away and forgot about it. 3 mornings later, the paint crew arrived. The paint crew showed up just after sunrise on a Friday. I remember the sound first. That rough, mechanical rattle of a compressor coughing to life somewhere outside my kitchen window. My father was sitting at the table with a mug of coffee, reading the sports page like he did every morning, and I was packing his medical folder into a tote bag because we had another appointment across town. Nothing about the morning felt unusual until I looked through the side window and saw 2 men in orange vests standing at the edge of my driveway with measuring tape stretched across the concrete. At first, I thought they had the wrong house. I stepped outside and asked what they were doing. One of the workers glanced at his clipboard, then at the side of my garage, and said they had a work order from the HOA to restripe an emergency access zone. I told him there had to be a mistake because that was my driveway. He shrugged the way contractors do when they know they are not being paid to argue with homeowners and said, "Ma'am, we're just painting where they told us to paint." That was when I saw Marlene's SUV parked across the street. She was sitting inside with the window cracked, watching. I walked over and asked her why a paint crew was measuring my driveway. She got out slowly, wearing sunglasses even though the sun had barely cleared the roofs, and told me the board had identified several problem areas where residents had been misusing access points. She said my driveway connected too closely to the common area and needed to be marked for community safety. I told her again that it was not a community access point. She said, "That is your interpretation." There was something cold in the way she said it, like my deed, my garage, my father's walker, and 20 years of recorded property history were just opinions that had become inconvenient. I asked to see the map the board was using. She tapped her clipboard and said the board's operational documents were not subject to on-demand inspection in the street. I asked whether the fire marshal had approved it. She said the HOA did not need my permission to maintain safety standards. I asked whether the county knew they were marking a private driveway. She smiled and said, "You are welcome to bring that up at the next meeting." Then she turned to the paint crew and said, loud enough for me to hear, "Take it all the way across. We need the marking to be clear." The men looked uncomfortable, but they did it. I stood there while they snapped a chalk line across the concrete and rolled out that thick yellow stripe from one side of my driveway to the other. Then they laid down the stencil. Letter by letter, the words appeared in front of my house like a sentence being passed against me. No parking. HOA fire access. By the time they finished, my father was standing at the garage door, leaning on his walker, trying to understand why strangers were painting the way out of his own home. I still remember the look on his face. Not anger, not even confusion. It was embarrassment. The private kind. The kind older people feel when their independence is being negotiated in public by people who have never had to think twice about a curb. I told him to go back inside. Marlene heard me and said, "This is exactly why we need clear rules. People get emotional and forget the larger community." I wanted to answer her. I wanted to say a lot of things, but the paint was wet, the workers were packing up, and my father was standing there trying not to look helpless in front of the neighbors who had started drifting onto their porches. So I took pictures. Every angle, every cone, every brush mark, every inch of that yellow line touching the concrete that led to my garage. That afternoon, the first email arrived. It was a formal notice from the HOA Compliance Committee, even though I was pretty sure the committee was just Marlene and whoever agreed with her that week. The notice stated that my property had been adjacent to a newly designated emergency access zone and that residents were prohibited from obstructing, crossing, parking on, or interfering with marked fire access lanes. The fine for a first violation would be $500. Repeat violations could result in towing, legal action, and assessment of HOA attorney fees. I read that sentence 3 times. Crossing. They were not just saying I could not park there. They were saying I could not use my own driveway without risking a violation. I replied politely. I explained that the marked area was the only vehicle access to my garage. I attached a photo of the driveway, noted that it served my property, and asked for the authority under which the HOA had designated private driveway pavement as a fire access lane. I asked for the approved board minutes, the fire marshal approval, the county permit, and the map showing the exact boundary of the alleged community access area. Marlene responded 19 minutes later. Her email was short. The board has broad authority over visible exterior access areas for the health, safety, and welfare of the association. Your continued resistance is noted. That phrase, your continued resistance, told me everything. This was not about fire safety. It was about control. The next morning, I opened the garage door to take my father to physical therapy and found 2 orange cones placed directly across the driveway, just behind the yellow line. A temporary sign had been added overnight. It said, "Unauthorized vehicles would be towed at owner's expense." My car was in the garage. I called the HOA management company. The receptionist sounded tired before I even finished explaining. She put me on hold, came back, and said the board had directed that no vehicles be allowed to cross the marked area until the homeowner acknowledged the new access policy. I asked her how I was supposed to leave my house. She lowered her voice and said, "I'm just reading the note in the file." So I called Marlene. She answered on the second ring. I told her my father had an appointment. I told her the cones were blocking my only safe exit. I told her this was not a disagreement about landscaping or holiday lights. This was access to my home. She said, "Then I suggest you comply instead of escalating." I looked through the garage at my father sitting in the passenger seat, already buckled in, trying to pretend he could not hear every word. I moved 1 cone 6 inches so I could back out safely. Before my tires even touched the yellow paint, Marlene stepped from behind her SUV with her phone in her hand, recording me like she had been waiting for that exact moment. A tow truck rolled slowly around the corner at the same time, amber lights blinking in the morning sun. That was not enforcement. That was a trap. The driver stopped at the curb and asked Marlene whether she wanted the vehicle removed. I got out of the car and told him I was leaving my own garage. He looked at the yellow line, then at Marlene, then at me. I could see he wanted no part of it. Marlene told him the vehicle was violating a restricted emergency zone. I told him the driveway was mine. She said, "The association has already documented the violation." Neighbors had come outside by then. One man from across the street folded his arms like he was watching a show. A woman 2 houses down whispered something to her husband. Someone actually said, "Isn't that the fire lane issue?" The fire lane issue. That was how fast a lie became a neighborhood fact when it came from a person holding a clipboard. The tow driver finally backed off and said he needed written authorization from the management company before hooking a vehicle on disputed private property. Marlene did not like that. Her face tightened, but she kept her voice sweet and official. She told him she would make sure future instructions were clearer. Then she looked at me and said, "This will be reflected in your violation history. I drove my father to therapy 20 minutes late." He did not say much on the way there. He just kept one hand pressed against the door handle, staring out the window. Finally, at a red light, he said, "I'm sorry I'm making this harder for you." That hurt worse than the paint, because none of this was his fault. He had worked for 40 years, paid taxes, raised a family, buried his wife, survived surgery, and now some HOA president had made him feel like his need to leave the house safely was an inconvenience to community aesthetics. By the time we came home, there was a printed notice taped to my front door. The HOA had issued a $500 fine for unauthorized crossing of a marked emergency access area. It also warned that any removal or disturbance of cones, signs, pavement markings, or association safety equipment would be treated as destruction of HOA property. They were calling the cones theirs. They were calling the sign theirs. They were calling the paint theirs. And somehow, they were acting like the driveway underneath all of it was theirs too. Over the next 3 days, the pressure got worse. Someone left a note in my mailbox that said, "Stop blocking fire access." Some of us care about safety. Another neighbor stopped waving when I drove past. A board member named Dennis sent a group email reminding residents that selfish parking habits could endanger the entire subdivision, even though he never used my name. He did not have to. Everyone knew who he meant. The HOA portal showed a new balance on my account, $500, plus a $25 administrative fee. Then came the second violation. According to the notice, my vehicle had been seen crossing the restricted zone again at 8:42 a.m. The evidence was a blurry photo taken from across the street, showing my car leaving the garage. In other words, they were fining me for using the driveway exactly as it had been designed to be used. This time, the fine was $750. I stopped sleeping well after that. Every noise outside made me wonder if they were adding another sign, another cone, another violation. Every time I opened the garage, I checked the street for tow trucks. My father started asking whether we should park somewhere else so we did not cause trouble. That was when I knew Marlene had done more than paint a line. She had made my father feel like a guest in the home we owned. And still, I did not rip up the cones. I did not scrape the paint. I did not yell at Marlene in the street, even when she walked past my house with that satisfied little smile, pretending this was all a neutral safety policy. Instead, I started saving everything. Screenshots of the HOA portal, copies of every notice, photos of the cones blocking the driveway, videos of the tow truck, my emails asking for authority, Marlene's replies refusing to provide it, the group message implying I was endangering the neighborhood, the handwritten note from my mailbox, even the appointment records showing the delays caused by the blocked access. Because by then, I understood something important. Marlene did not just want me fined. She wanted me isolated. She wanted the neighbors to see me as reckless, the management company to see me as difficult, and the board to see her as the person strong enough to handle me. But the mistake people like Marlene make is believing that confidence is the same thing as authority. It is not. Authority is written down somewhere. It has signatures, dates, maps, permits, records, boundaries. And if the HOA wanted to turn my private driveway into their fire lane, then somewhere there had to be a legal document proving they had the right. So that night, after my father went to bed, I pulled the plastic storage bin from the hallway closet, carried it to the kitchen table, and started digging through every paper I had received when I bought the house. Mortgage documents, inspection reports, title policy, old disclosures, warranty packets, a faded subdivision plat. And near the bottom, clipped behind my original boundary survey, I found the page I had forgotten about, recorded access easement. The moment I saw those words, the whole room went quiet. Because if that document said what I thought it said, then Marlene had not painted a safety zone. She had painted evidence. I did not sleep that night. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft click of my father's bedroom door whenever the air conditioner kicked on. Outside, the yellow paint across my driveway looked almost white under the porch light, like a scar someone had left on the concrete and expected me to live with. The paper in front of me said recorded access easement. I read it once and understood almost none of it. Then I read it again, slower. The language was stiff and legal, full of parcel numbers, bearings, measurements, and phrases nobody uses in normal life. But certain words stood out so clearly that I felt my pulse change. Permanent, non-exclusive, but unobstructed, for the benefit of the residents located at my address. Ingress and egress. Those words meant access. They meant movement. They meant the driveway was not some decorative strip of pavement the HOA could repaint whenever Marlene wanted to make a point. It existed for a legal purpose. It served my property. And most importantly, it had been recorded with the county long before Marlene ever sat behind a folding table at an HOA meeting, pretending her clipboard was a court order. I did not celebrate. Not yet. A document in a storage bin was not enough. I had seen how Marlene operated. She did not need to be right to make life miserable. She only needed enough confidence, enough vague rule language, and enough neighbors willing to believe that anyone disagreeing with the HOA must be hiding something. So I started building a file. The first thing I did was download every camera clip from the day the paint crew arrived. My front porch camera had caught the workers measuring the driveway. My garage camera had captured them stepping past the edge of the street and onto the concrete that led directly to my garage. But the clearest footage came from the little side camera I had installed after someone stole a package the year before. That camera showed Marlene. It showed her standing beside the paint crew, pointing across my driveway with two sharp movements of her hand. The audio was not perfect, but it was clear enough. I could hear her say, "Take it all the way across. We need the marking to be clear." A few seconds later, when one of the workers asked whether the homeowner had been notified, she said, "The board has authority. Just follow the work order." I saved that clip 3 different ways. Then I took photographs in daylight with a measuring tape stretched across the paint. I photographed the yellow line from the street, from the garage, from the side yard, and from the exact place where my father had stood with his walker. I photographed the cones. I photographed the sign. I photographed the tire tracks where I had backed out to take him to physical therapy. I even photographed the tiny splatters of yellow paint on the edge of the garage apron, because if this became a fight about where the paint actually landed, I wanted every inch documented before anyone tried to clean it up or deny it. After that, I opened my email and made folders. HOA notices, Marlene, driveway evidence, tow truck, medical delays. It felt excessive while I was doing it, but every time I wondered whether I was being dramatic, I looked out the window at the fake fire lane across my private driveway and kept going. I saved the original traffic safety improvement email. I saved my reply asking for authority. I saved Marlene's answer about broad authority over visible exterior access areas. I saved the fine notices from the HOA portal as PDFs because I did not trust the portal not to change later. I took screenshots showing the timestamps, the fine amounts, the administrative fees, and the words unauthorized crossing. Then I wrote a timeline. Not emotional, not angry, just facts. Tuesday, traffic safety email sent with no map attached. Friday, paint crew arrived. Friday afternoon, first violation notice issued. Saturday morning, cones blocked garage access. Saturday, tow truck present. Monday, second fine issued for vehicle exiting garage. When I finished, the whole thing looked less like a misunderstanding and more like a plan. The next morning, I called the county clerk's office. I expected a maze of transfers, hold music, and people telling me to call someone else. Instead, I reached a woman named Carla who sounded like she had spent 25 years listening to homeowners discover what was hiding in their property records. I gave her my parcel number, my address, and the recording reference printed at the top of the easement page. There was a long pause while she searched. Then she said, "Yes, I see it." I gripped the phone harder. She told me the access easement had been recorded with the original subdivision plat and remained active. There was no release, no termination, no amendment, and no later filing showing the HOA had gained the right to obstruct or redesignate that driveway. She explained that she could not give legal advice, but she could provide certified copies of the easement, the plat map, and the related deed references. I ordered all of them. When she asked whether I wanted regular copies or certified copies, I said certified. I did not fully understand how much it mattered yet. I just knew that if Marlene wanted paper, I wanted paper that came from the county with a stamp. The next call was to the fire marshal's office. That one took longer. I left a message, then another. When someone finally called back, I explained that the HOA had painted "No Parking, HOA Fire Access" across my driveway and was claiming it had been designated as an emergency access lane. The deputy fire marshal asked for my address, then went quiet while he checked his system. He came back and said he had no record of an approved fire lane at my property. No approved plan, no inspection, no fire department designation, no authorization for signage. He asked me to email photographs of the markings and the sign. I sent them within 5 minutes. I included the HOA notice claiming the area was a restricted emergency access zone. I included the photo of the cones. I included Marlene's email. His reply came later that afternoon, and I read it 3 times. He wrote that based on the information available to his office, the marked area did not appear to be an approved fire lane or designated emergency access route. He also wrote that unauthorized or misleading fire access markings could create confusion for emergency responders and should be reviewed by the appropriate local authority. That sentence was the first moment I felt the ground shift under Marlene, because she had not just annoyed me, she had invoked public safety without the public safety office behind her. Still, I needed the property line confirmed. The survey from my closing packet was old. It showed the driveway, the lot boundary, and the easement area, but I knew the HOA would say it was outdated, unclear, or not specific enough. So I hired a licensed surveyor. His name was Paul, and he arrived 2 days later in a white truck with equipment that looked far more serious than anything Marlene had brought to my driveway. He set up near the curb, checked control points, walked the edge of my property, and placed small temporary markers along the relevant lines. I followed at a distance, holding my folder like a student waiting for exam results. Marlene appeared halfway through. Of course she did. She came down the sidewalk in workout clothes, phone in one hand, sunglasses on, pretending she had just happened to be passing by. She asked Paul what he was doing. He told her he was performing a boundary and easement location survey at the request of the property owner. She said the HOA needed to be notified before any survey work affecting common area. Paul looked at her and said, "I'm not altering anything. I'm measuring." That was the first time I saw someone official refuse to be impressed by her tone. Marlene turned to me and said, "You are making this much more serious than it needs to be." I said, "You painted my driveway." She said, "We marked an access zone." Paul looked down at the yellow line, then back at his equipment, and said nothing. Somehow his silence was more powerful than anything I could have said. 2 days after that, his preliminary findings arrived by email. The yellow stripe crossed pavement serving my parcel. The cones had been placed within the recorded access easement. Part of the painted marking extended over the boundary of my private lot, not merely near it. And the HOA sign had been installed in a location that interfered with ingress and egress to my garage. I printed the email and put it at the front of the binder. By then, the binder had become thick enough that it no longer felt like a homeowner complaint. It felt like a case file. But I still was not done. I called the HOA management company again and requested every board record related to the traffic safety improvement plan. I asked for meeting minutes, maps, contractor invoices, work orders, legal opinions, fire department communications, and any vote authorizing changes to my driveway or the easement area. At first, they ignored me. Then they sent a short response saying the board was reviewing my request. Then Marlene emailed me directly, even though I had asked the management company for records, and wrote, "Your attempt to overwhelm volunteers with excessive document demands will not change the association's enforcement authority." I saved that too. A week later, the management company sent exactly 3 documents: a generic board agenda, a contractor invoice for pavement marking, and 1 cropped map with a yellow highlight around the street near my house. The map had no county stamp, no survey reference, no fire marshal approval, and no indication that the person who drew the yellow highlight knew where my property line actually was. The contractor invoice was even more interesting. The description read, "Paint no parking fire access marking at Whitaker direction, side access near lot 18. At Whitaker direction. Not board-approved map, not county-approved plan, not fire marshal instruction. Whitaker direction." That phrase went straight into the timeline. The next day, I checked the county permit database. There were permits for fences, decks, roofing, driveway replacements, and utility work all over the subdivision. But there was nothing for fire lane markings at my address, nothing for signage, nothing for any alteration of access across my parcel or easement. I called code enforcement and asked whether private HOAs could install fire lane markings without fire marshal approval. The person on the phone was careful. She said rules varied depending on road ownership, access type, and local code. Then she asked me to send photographs and the survey information when I had it. I sent everything. For the next few days, my life became 2 realities at once. In one reality, I made breakfast, drove my father to appointments, worked from home, bought groceries, and tried to act normal. In the other reality, I lived inside a growing archive of proof. Every email mattered. Every photograph mattered. Every careless phrase from Marlene mattered. And Marlene kept giving me more. She sent another notice saying my continued use of the driveway demonstrated willful disregard for community safety. She warned that the HOA could suspend certain privileges if the fines remained unpaid. She copied 2 board members and the management company. I replied only once. I wrote, "Please provide the recorded document, approved fire marshal designation, county permit, or board authority granting the HOA the right to obstruct the driveway and access easement serving my property." She did not answer the question. Instead, she wrote, "The board will not debate settled association policy with you by email." Settled association policy. That was the trick. She wanted to turn a property right into a policy disagreement. She wanted everyone to think this was about whether I liked HOA rules, not whether the HOA had touched land and access rights. It had no legal authority to control. So I stopped arguing with her. I made one more call, this time to a real estate attorney whose name I got from a neighbor in another subdivision. I told his assistant I had an HOA dispute involving driveway access, a recorded easement, fire lane markings, fines, and possible obstruction of ingress and egress. There was a pause. Then she said, "Send the documents." I sent the binder digitally, the easement, deed, plat map, survey findings, fire marshal email, HOA notices, photos, videos, contractor invoice, timeline, and every message from Marlene. The attorney called me the next afternoon. He did not sound dramatic. He did not promise revenge. He did not tell me we were going to destroy anyone. He simply said, "You were right to preserve everything." Then he said the words I had been waiting to hear. "If these documents are accurate, the HOA has a serious problem." I sat down at the kitchen table because my knees suddenly felt weak. He explained that an HOA rule could not erase a recorded property interest. A board policy could not override an easement. A president's instruction to a contractor did not create fire marshal authority. And if the HOA had placed signs, cones, paint, and fines in a way that interfered with my lawful access, then this was no longer just a neighborhood disagreement. It was potential trespass, potential interference with easement rights, potential improper enforcement, potential damages. That night, while my father watched baseball in the living room, I looked through the binder again. The yellow paint was still outside. The fines were still on my account. Marlene was still HOA president. Nothing visible had changed, but everything underneath had changed. Because for the first time since this began, I was not reacting to her power. I was documenting the limits of it. And the most important proof was not hidden anymore. It was stamped by the county, confirmed by the fire marshal, measured by a licensed surveyor, and waiting on an attorney's desk. Marlene had spent 2 weeks making the neighborhood believe I was the problem. Now I had to show them the map. The attorney's office was on the second floor of a small brick building between a tax preparer and a dentist. It did not look dramatic from the outside. No marble lobby, no glass conference room high above the city, just a quiet waiting area with gray carpet, framed certificates, and a receptionist who asked if I wanted coffee while I sat there with a binder thick enough to feel heavier than it should have. My father wanted to come with me. I told him no at first, because I did not want him sitting through legal explanations, worrying about money, or listening to strangers describe our home like it was a problem to be solved. But he put on his jacket anyway, leaned on his walker by the front door, and said, "That driveway is mine too, in a way." So he came. The attorney's name was Daniel Price. He had silver hair, calm eyes, and the kind of voice that made you feel he had spent years watching people panic, while paperwork quietly decided the truth. He did not interrupt when I started from the beginning. He listened while I explained the yellow paint, the cones, the tow truck, the fines, the emails, the fire marshal, the surveyor, and Marlene standing across the street like she had finally found a way to punish me for asking questions. Every few minutes he wrote something on a legal pad. When I finished, he opened the certified easement copy from the county and placed it in the center of the table. Then he put the surveyor's preliminary findings beside it. Then the fire marshal's email. Then the HOA fine notice. Then he leaned back and said, "This is not a parking dispute." I did not say anything. He tapped the easement map with one finger. "This document gives your parcel the right of ingress and egress over that driveway area. The language says unobstructed. It is recorded. It runs with the land. That means the HOA cannot simply pass a rule, paint a line, and pretend the right disappeared." My father sat very still beside me. Daniel continued. He said there were several problems for the HOA. The first was trespass, because part of the paint appeared to be on pavement located within my private lot boundary. The second was interference with easement rights, because the cones and signage obstructed the access described in the recorded document. The third was improper enforcement, because the fines were based on a restriction that the HOA had not shown any legal authority to impose. The fourth was the fire lane claim, which was especially dangerous for them because the fire marshal had already stated that the area was not an approved fire lane. Then he looked at the contractor invoice. "At Whitaker direction," he read aloud. I had underlined those words. He looked up and asked, "Was this voted on by the full board?" I told him the management company had not provided any valid minutes showing that. He asked whether the HOA had produced a legal opinion, permit, fire department approval, or recorded map. I said no. He nodded once, like he had expected that answer. Then he said, "Good. We are going to ask them for all of it in writing." There was no big speech, no promise to make them suffer, no revenge fantasy, just a legal plan, clean and cold. Daniel drafted a demand letter that afternoon. It was 6 pages long, and every sentence felt like a door closing on one of Marlene's excuses. The letter stated that the HOA had caused unauthorized markings to be applied across pavement serving my property, placed cones and signage that interfered with a recorded access easement, issued fines for ordinary use of a lawful driveway, and represented the area as an HOA fire access lane, without evidence of fire marshal approval. The demands were specific. Remove all cones, signs, and temporary barriers within 48 hours. Cease issuing fines or enforcement notices related to use of the driveway. Rescind all existing fines and administrative charges. Provide all board minutes, work orders, maps, approvals, permits, and communications related to the marking. Pay for professional removal of the paint and restoration of the driveway surface. Reimburse my survey costs. Reimburse initial attorney fees. Confirm in writing that the HOA would not interfere with the recorded access easement again. And then came the part that made my hands tighten around the edge of the table. If the HOA failed to comply, Daniel wrote, we were prepared to pursue claims for trespass, interference with easement rights, declaratory relief, injunctive relief, damages, and attorney fees. For 2 weeks, Marlene had been throwing HOA phrases at me like they were law. Now actual legal language was going back the other way. The letter went out by certified mail and email to the HOA board, the management company, and the association's registered agent. Marlene replied before the certified copy was even delivered. Not the HOA attorney, not the management company. Marlene. Her email was addressed to me, not Daniel, even though the demand letter clearly told them to direct all communication through counsel. She wrote that my attorney had misunderstood the nature of HOA authority and that the board's duty to protect safety outweighed individual preferences regarding access. Individual preferences. That was what she called my father's ability to leave the garage without being threatened by a tow truck. She also wrote that the easement did not prevent the HOA from establishing reasonable restrictions and that my refusal to cooperate had forced the board to consider stronger remedies. I forwarded the email to Daniel without answering. He replied with one sentence, "Do not engage," so I did not. The next morning, the management company sent a much more careful message. It said the HOA had referred the matter to its legal counsel and would be reviewing the documents. The tone had changed completely. Gone were the phrases about resistance, violation history, and settled association policy. Suddenly, everyone needed time to review. But Marlene was not finished. At 7:30 that evening, she called an emergency board meeting. A neighbor texted me about it. Then another. Apparently the topic was homeowner challenge to emergency access authority. Marlene had told people I was trying to dismantle a safety improvement and expose the HOA to liability. She wanted the board to authorize additional enforcement and possible suspension of privileges. What she did not know was that one board member had finally had enough. His name was Robert Ellis. He was retired, quiet, and had rarely spoken during meetings. I only knew him as the man who walked a black Labrador every morning and nodded politely at everyone. After that emergency meeting, Robert sent me an email from his personal account. It had one attachment, boardnotes.trafficplan.pdf. His message said, "I do not believe the board was given complete information before this action was taken." I opened the attachment at my kitchen table with my father sitting across from me. It was not formal minutes. It was a set of internal notes from a planning discussion 3 weeks before the paint appeared. Most of it was boring. Road striping, parking complaints, delivery vans, visibility near the curve. Then I found the section about my driveway. Marlene had referred to it as the side access by Lot 18. She had said residents were becoming too comfortable treating association-facing areas as private. Someone had asked whether the driveway was subject to an old easement. Marlene had replied that easements were not the issue and that visual control mattered because homeowners needed to understand the board's authority. Then there was one sentence that changed everything. Marking the area clearly may set a precedent and discourage further challenges. I read it once, then again. Then I slid the page across the table to my father. He adjusted his glasses, read it slowly, and exhaled through his nose. For the first time in weeks, he looked angry. Not sad, not embarrassed. Angry. "She knew," he said. That was the legal turn I had not expected. Until then, the HOA could try to argue mistake. Confusion, safety concerns, poor communication. Maybe they believed the driveway was part of some access area. Maybe the contractor painted too far. Maybe the documents were unclear. But those notes showed the easement had been raised before the painting happened. They knew there might be a recorded property right. They moved forward anyway. Not only that, Marlene had framed the action as a way to set a precedent and discourage challenges. That made it look less like a safety project and more like targeted enforcement against a homeowner she considered difficult. I sent the notes to Daniel immediately. He called me within 15 minutes. His tone was still calm but sharper now. "This is important," he said. "Very important." He explained that the notes could support the argument that the HOA acted with knowledge of a possible easement and chose not to verify the authority before interfering. It also undercut their safety narrative. If this was truly about emergency access, the fire marshal, county records, and proper approvals would have come first. Instead, the notes suggested the board was more interested in control, precedent, and discouraging homeowner resistance. The next letter Daniel sent was different. It was addressed to the HOA's attorney. It included the internal notes, the certified easement, the surveyor's findings, the fire marshal email, the contractor invoice, and photographs of the cones blocking the garage. Daniel wrote that the association's continued enforcement after receiving notice of the recorded easement could increase exposure to damages and attorney fees. He also requested preservation of all records, including emails, texts, meeting notes, contractor communications, and communications between board members regarding my property. That phrase mattered, preservation of records. It meant no deleting, no editing minutes after the fact, no pretending conversations never happened, no making inconvenient emails disappear. The HOA's attorney responded 3 days later. His letter was professional, cautious, and absolutely nothing like Marlene's emails. He did not claim victory. He did not say the HOA had broad authority over everything visible from the street. He did not accuse me of endangering the neighborhood. Instead, he wrote that the association was conducting a review and temporarily suspending enforcement related to the marked area. Temporarily. That word irritated me, but Daniel told me not to worry. They are stepping back without admitting they stepped on the wrong land, he said. That is normal. Still, the cones disappeared the next morning. No one knocked. No one apologized. I opened the garage door and saw the driveway clear for the first time in weeks. The yellow paint was still there, loud and ugly, but the physical blockage was gone. My father stood beside me and looked down the driveway like he was seeing a road reopen after a storm. He said, "I guess the map speaks louder than she does." I laughed for the first time since the whole thing started. But Marlene could not leave it alone. At the next regular HOA meeting, she tried to control the story before anyone could ask questions. She stood at the front of the clubhouse with a stack of papers and announced that there had been misinformation about the traffic safety improvement plan. She said the board had acted in good faith, that certain residents had chosen an adversarial route, and that the association would not be intimidated by legal threats. She never said my name. She did not need to. Everyone looked at me. I was sitting in the third row with my father on one side and Robert Ellis on the other. My binder was on my lap. Daniel had advised me not to argue, not to make accusations, and not to interrupt. So I listened. Then Marlene made her mistake. She said, "There is no evidence that the association knowingly interfered with anyone's recorded property rights." Robert stood up. The room went quiet. He did not raise his voice. He simply said, "That is not accurate." Marlene's face changed. Robert asked the management representative whether homeowners had the right to request records related to the traffic plan. The representative said yes, within the limits of the governing documents and state law. Then Robert said he believed the board needed to acknowledge that the easement issue had been brought up before the driveway was painted. Marlene cut him off and said executive discussions should not be mischaracterized in open session. But the damage was done. People started whispering. For the first time, the room was not looking at me like the problem. They were looking at Marlene like she had something to hide. A homeowner in the back asked whether the fire marshal had approved the markings. Marlene said the board had relied on safety recommendations. The homeowner asked again whether the fire marshal had approved the markings. Marlene did not answer directly. Another homeowner asked whether the painted area was actually private property. Marlene said property boundaries in planned communities can be complex. Someone else asked whether the HOA had fined me for leaving my own garage. The management representative shifted in her chair and said the matter was under legal review. Under legal review. Those 3 words changed the temperature of the room. Marlene had spent weeks using the appearance of authority to make me look unreasonable. But now, with the easement map, the fire marshal email, the survey, the contractor invoice, and Robert's notes, the appearance was cracking. After the meeting, 2 neighbors who had ignored me for days came over quietly. One of them apologized for believing the fire lane story. The other asked whether the HOA could do the same thing to her side yard because there was a drainage swale near her fence. That was the moment I realized the legal twist was bigger than my driveway. Marlene had not just crossed a yellow line on concrete. She had shown everyone what could happen when an HOA board decided that recorded property rights were flexible, that safety language could be used as a weapon, and that homeowners would be too tired, too scared, or too embarrassed to check the records. The next week, the surveyor finalized his report. It was precise, stamped, and impossible to spin. The report confirmed that the painted marking crossed pavement within my parcel boundary and obstructed the recorded access easement serving my property. It included diagrams, measurements, photographs, and references to the county plat. The easement area was not theoretical anymore. It was drawn clearly in black and white, with the yellow paint marked right across it. Daniel sent the final survey report to the HOA attorney with a revised demand. This time, the demand included a deadline, professional removal of all unauthorized markings, written rescission of all fines, reimbursement of survey and attorney costs, compensation for loss of use and disruption of access, written acknowledgement of the recorded easement, a commitment that no future markings, signs, barriers, or enforcement actions would affect the driveway without proper legal authority and written notice, and if they refused, we would seek a court order. That was the part Marlene had not prepared for. She understood warnings. She understood fines. She understood social pressure, public embarrassment, and making people feel isolated. But she had no answer for a recorded map. She had no answer for certified county documents. She had no answer for a fire marshal saying her fire lane was not a fire lane. She had no answer for a surveyor putting the property line exactly where I had said it was. And she definitely had no answer for her own internal note saying the paint was meant to set a precedent and discourage challenges. The day after the deadline letter went out, I saw Marlene outside near the marked driveway again. She was alone this time. No tow truck, no cones, no clipboard. Just her phone in one hand, staring down at the yellow letters like they had betrayed her. For weeks, those words had been her weapon. No parking, HOA fire access. Now they were evidence of every step she took without authority. She looked up and saw me watching from the porch. For the first time, she did not smile. She turned and walked away. That was when I knew the power had shifted. Not because I had shouted, not because I had threatened her, not because I had done anything dramatic enough for the neighbors to film on their phones. The power shifted because the question was no longer whether I would obey the HOA. The question was whether the HOA could prove it had ever had the right to touch my driveway in the first place. And the answer was sitting in a county record book, stamped years before Marlene ever decided the rules were whatever she said they were. The county inspection was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and somehow the whole neighborhood knew before the inspector's truck even turned onto our street. By 8:45, people were pretending to water lawns, check mailboxes, sweep porches, and walk dogs that clearly did not need walking. My father sat near the front window with a cup of coffee he barely touched. I stood in the driveway with my binder under one arm and Daniel Price beside me, calm as ever, wearing a navy suit that made the whole situation feel less like HOA drama and more like the beginning of a hearing. At 9:02, a white county vehicle parked at the curb. A code enforcement inspector stepped out first. Her name was Denise Carter, and she carried a tablet, a measuring wheel, and the kind of expression that said she had heard every version of, "But the HOA said," at least 100 times. A few minutes later, the deputy fire marshal arrived in a separate vehicle. Then Paul, the surveyor, pulled in behind them with his equipment case. Marlene arrived last. She came walking down the sidewalk with 2 board members and the HOA management representative. But this time there was no tow truck, no cones, and no little smile of victory. She still had her clipboard, but it looked smaller now, almost silly. Denise introduced herself and explained that the county was there to review the reported unauthorized fire access marking, possible obstruction of a recorded easement, and potential work performed outside approved authority. Marlene immediately tried to frame it as an internal association matter. She said the HOA had acted in good faith to protect safety, and that one homeowner had created confusion by refusing to follow community rules. Denise did not argue. She simply asked for the approved fire lane documentation. Marlene looked at the management representative. The management representative looked at the HOA attorney, who had arrived quietly and was standing near the curb with a folder in his hand. No one produced a fire marshal approval. The deputy fire marshal stepped forward and looked down at the yellow letters painted across my driveway. He studied the words, "No parking, HOA fire access," then looked toward the garage, then back at the street. He stated that his office had no record of this location being approved, inspected, or designated as a fire lane. He also explained that fire access markings were not decorative warnings an HOA could invent for convenience. They had to correspond to an actual approved emergency access route, because misleading markings could confuse residents, contractors, tow companies, and emergency personnel. For the first time since this began, Marlene had to listen without interrupting. Then Paul opened his survey map on a portable stand. The mood changed the moment the map came out. Until then, Marlene had been speaking in phrases: safety, community, access, authority, policy. Paul spoke in lines, markers, measurements, and recorded references. He pointed to the parcel boundary. He pointed to the recorded easement. He pointed to the driveway apron. Then he pointed to the yellow stripe. The marking crossed pavement serving my lot and extended into the area protected by the access easement. The temporary cones, when they had been placed in front of the garage, had interfered directly with ingress and egress. The signpost had been installed within the functional access path, and according to the county plat, there was no recorded HOA right to convert that driveway into a restricted fire access lane. Denise took photographs from every angle. She measured the distance from the garage entrance to the painted line. She photographed the overspray along the edge of the concrete. She asked Daniel for the certified easement copy, then compared the recording number to the plat reference. She asked the HOA attorney whether the association had obtained a permit for the marking or any written authorization from the property owner. The attorney gave a careful answer. The association was still reviewing the underlying authority. That was lawyer language, for they did not have it. Marlene finally tried to speak again. She said the board had a duty to act when homeowners created safety concerns, and that the driveway's location near common area made it part of the broader access environment. Denise looked at her tablet and asked whether any emergency agency had requested this marking. Marlene said the board had discussed safety internally. Denise asked again whether any emergency agency had requested it. Marlene did not answer. The deputy fire marshal then said the marking needed to be removed or corrected because it falsely suggested official fire access designation. He added that if the HOA wanted to establish a fire lane in the future, it would need proper review, proper maps, proper authorization, and it still could not override recorded private property rights without a lawful basis. That sentence landed like a gavel. Across the street, the neighbors who had been pretending not to watch stopped pretending. Denise issued a written correction notice before she left. The HOA was ordered to remove the unauthorized signage, submit a plan for professional paint removal, and provide documentation for any future access-related markings near private property lines. The notice also required the HOA to preserve and provide contractor work orders, board authorization records, and any communications related to the decision to mark the driveway. Marlene's face went pale when Denise mentioned communications, because by then, everyone knew about Robert's notes. But the county inspection was only the first hit. The second came at the HOA meeting the following week. The clubhouse was packed. People who had not attended a meeting in years showed up and filled every folding chair. Some stood along the walls. My father sat beside me in the front row, not because he wanted attention, but because he wanted Marlene to see the person her safety plan had trapped inside a garage. Daniel did not make a speech. He did not need to. The management company representative read a short statement saying, "Enforcement related to my driveway had been suspended pending resolution." Then the HOA attorney explained that the association had received notice from county code enforcement and the fire marshal regarding the unauthorized marking. He recommended that the board approve immediate remediation and rescind all fines connected to the disputed access area. The word rescind moved through the room like electricity. A man in the back asked how much this had already cost. No one answered. A woman near the front asked why residents had been told it was a fire access issue if the fire marshal had never approved it. Another homeowner asked whether the HOA had checked the easement before painting. Someone else asked whether any other property lines had been altered or marked without owner consent. Marlene tried to regain control. She spoke about good faith, community responsibility, and misinformation. But every time she used one of those broad phrases, someone asked for a document. Where was the approval? Where was the permit? Where was the map? Where was the vote? Where was the legal opinion? For weeks, she had controlled the story by making it emotional. She made me look stubborn, selfish, dramatic, and unsafe. But in that room, emotion no longer helped her. The story had become a record, a timeline, a county file, a survey, a demand letter, an insurance claim waiting to happen. Then Robert stood again. He said the board had been warned that an easement might exist before the paint was applied. He said the board should have verified the records before authorizing anything that affected access to a private garage. He said residents deserved to know whether the association's power had been used to solve a safety problem or to punish a homeowner who questioned the president's authority. Marlene snapped that he was mischaracterizing confidential discussions. The room turned on her right there, not with shouting, not with chaos, with silence. The kind of silence that happens when people finally realize the person demanding trust has been hiding behind procedure. The HOA attorney leaned toward Marlene and whispered something. She sat down. That was the moment she lost the room. After the meeting, the association's insurance carrier became involved. Daniel had already notified them of a potential claim for property damage, interference with access, improper enforcement, and reimbursement of costs. Insurance companies do not care about HOA pride. They care about exposure. And once they saw the fire marshal email, the survey report, the contractor invoice showing Whitaker direction, and the internal notes about setting a precedent, they moved faster than the board ever had. An adjuster came out to inspect the driveway surface. He photographed the paint, the overspray, and the areas where removal could damage the seal coat. He asked for the dates when access had been blocked and whether my father's medical appointments had been delayed. He asked for copies of the fines and the notices threatening towing. He asked whether any contractor had received written permission from me to work on the driveway. The answer was no. A week later, Daniel told me the HOA's insurer was pushing for settlement, not because Marlene had suddenly understood fairness, because the documents were bad for them. The county file was bad for them, the fire marshal's statement was bad for them, the survey was bad for them, and Marlene's own words were the worst part. The contractor also got pulled into the mess. Code enforcement requested their work order and proof of authorization. The company owner called me personally, nervous and apologetic, explaining that his crew had relied on the HOA's instructions and had not realized the marking crossed private driveway access. Daniel told me not to respond directly, so I forwarded the message. Later, I learned the contractor had been warned that future pavement markings near private property required clearer authorization, especially when using terms like fire access. By then, the yellow paint was no longer a symbol of HOA control. It was a liability everyone wanted removed. The actual removal happened on a cold morning with Denise Carter watching from the sidewalk, the insurance adjuster taking photographs, and Paul's survey markers still visible near the edge of the concrete. A professional crew used approved methods to strip the paint without grinding too deep into the driveway surface. They worked slowly, because every pass of the machine was being documented. Marlene did not come outside, but half the neighborhood did. The same neighbors who had once whispered about the fire lane issue now stood quietly as the false fire lane disappeared inch by inch. The yellow letters broke apart first. No parking became no par, then fragments of yellow dust and residue. HOA fire access faded next, and I remember feeling something loosen in my chest as those words vanished from the concrete. My father watched from the garage in his jacket, both hands resting on his walker. When the crew finished, the driveway looked scarred but open. Open mattered more. Denise completed her inspection notes and told the HOA representative that no further access markings were to be installed there without proper documentation, review, and authority. The deputy fire marshal's office sent a written confirmation that the location was not an approved fire lane. Daniel received formal notice that the fines would be rescinded pending settlement paperwork. For the first time in almost a month, I backed my car out of the garage without checking for cones, tow trucks, or Marlene's phone pointed at me from across the street. No one stopped me. No one fined me. No one called it a violation. The driveway was just a driveway again. But the HOA was not just an HOA anymore. It was an association under scrutiny, with residents asking for records, board members turning on each other, an insurer calculating damages, and a president who could no longer hide behind the word safety. Marlene had started with paint because paint looked official. She had added cones because cones looked enforceable. She had called it fire access because fire access sounded untouchable. But once the county, the surveyor, the fire marshal, the attorney, and the insurance company stepped in, Every one of those props had to answer the same question: where is your authority? And for all her confidence, all her warnings, all her fines, all her public speeches about community welfare, Marlene never had a real answer. She only had a yellow line, and now even that was gone. The settlement did not arrive like a movie ending. There was no judge slamming a gavel, no dramatic confession from Marlene in front of the whole neighborhood, no moment where she stood on my porch and admitted she had been wrong. It arrived as a PDF attachment in an email from Daniel Price. I opened it at the kitchen table while my father sat across from me, slowly turning a spoon through a bowl of oatmeal he had let go cold. The subject line was simple: proposed settlement agreement. But the words inside felt heavier than anything Marlene had ever sent me. The HOA agreed to rescind all fines and administrative fees related to the driveway. They agreed to reimburse my survey costs, my initial attorney fees, and the professional restoration of the driveway surface. They agreed to pay an additional amount for the temporary loss of access and disruption caused by the cones, tow threats, and improper enforcement notices. They agreed to provide written acknowledgement that my driveway was protected by a recorded access easement and that the association would not place signs, cones, paint, barriers, or restrictions in that area without proper legal authority. Most importantly, they agreed that the yellow marking would not return. I read that sentence twice. Then I passed the laptop to my father. He leaned close to the screen, adjusted his glasses, and nodded without saying anything. For a man who had spent weeks apologizing for needing the driveway, that nod meant more than a celebration. The money mattered. The reimbursement mattered. The legal fees mattered, because I had not asked for this fight, and I should not have had to pay to prove I could use my own garage. But what mattered most was the written acknowledgement. The HOA had to put in writing what Marlene had spent a month denying. The driveway was not theirs. The easement was real. My access could not be blocked just because a board president wanted to set a precedent. A few days later, a formal letter went out to every homeowner in the subdivision. The language was careful, sanitized, and clearly written by an attorney. It said the association had completed a review of the Traffic Safety Improvement Plan and determined that certain markings near Lot 18 had been installed without sufficient documentation. It said all related fines had been rescinded. It said the board would adopt new procedures for any future work near private property lines, easements, driveways, or common area boundaries. It did not say Marlene's name. It did not say she had pointed across my driveway and told the crew to paint all the way across. It did not say my father had been trapped behind cones while a tow truck waited nearby. It did not say neighbors had been led to believe I was endangering the community. But everyone knew. By then, the story had traveled through the neighborhood faster than any HOA newsletter ever had. People had seen the county inspector. They had watched the paint come off. They had heard the fire marshal say it was not an approved fire lane. They had sat in that meeting while Marlene failed to produce a permit, a map, or a real answer. The next board election was not close. Marlene lost her seat by a margin so wide that even her closest supporters looked stunned. Robert Ellis was elected president, mostly because he promised something almost radical for that neighborhood: no enforcement without documents, no projects near property lines without proper review, and no using the word safety as a shield for personal control. The new board passed a written policy requiring a current survey, owner notice, permit review, and legal verification before the HOA could approve any work affecting driveways, easements, fences, drainage areas, or boundary lines. They also opened a review of several past enforcement actions. That part surprised me. Once one homeowner proves the board overstepped, other people start checking their own files. The retired couple with the mulch fine requested records. The young family with the stroller warning challenged their notice. The man with the satellite dish found his old approval letter. For the first time in years, residents walked into HOA meetings carrying folders instead of fear. As for my driveway, it never looked perfect again. Even after the restoration, if the afternoon light hits the concrete at a certain angle, I can still see a faint ghost of where the yellow letters used to be. At first, that bothered me. I wanted every trace gone. I wanted the driveway to look exactly like it had before Marlene decided she could repaint my property rights. But over time, I stopped hating it. That faint mark became a reminder, not of what they took from me, but of what they failed to take. My father still uses that driveway. He still moves slowly. Some mornings are difficult, some appointments are exhausting. But now when I back the car out of the garage, there are no cones, no tow trucks, no fake fire lane signs, and no HOA president standing across the street with a phone in her hand. There is just open pavement, and sometimes that is what victory looks like. Not revenge, not humiliation, not becoming as cruel as the person who tried to hurt you, just getting your boundary back. Marlene thought power meant speaking louder, sending notices, threatening fines, and making neighbors afraid to question her. But real power was quieter. It was in a deed no one had bothered to read. It was in a county record stamped years before her presidency. It was in a camera clip, a survey marker, a fire marshal's email, and a homeowner who decided not to tear down the cones, but to document why they should never have been there. That is the lesson I took from all of it. When someone tries to redraw your property line with confidence, do not answer with panic. Answer with records. Take pictures, save emails, read your deed, check the county files, ask for the permit, get the survey, make them show the authority they claim to have, because sometimes the person pointing at your driveway and telling you the community owns it is not enforcing the rules. They are hoping you never read them. And if this story made you think of an HOA, a neighbor, or a contractor who crossed a line they thought no one would defend, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment with what you would have done, save this story for later, and subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary homeowners who did not win by being louder, but by being right.